Our second panel carries the overarching rubric, The Social and Political Impact of the Voting Rights Act. And we're grateful to our two distinguished panelists and our equally distinguished moderator for joining us this afternoon. Panelist Patricia Williams, at the far end, is a professor of law at Columbia University and a columnist for The Nation, America's most venerable political weekly with a perspective from the left. She is a Boston native and a Wellesley graduate and the recipient of one of those famous MacArthur Foundation awards, the ones that come with the plea to journalists not to use the G word. She is the author of many books, including The Alchemy of Race and Politics and Seeing a Colorblind Future. Abigail Thernstrom, in the center chair, is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute in New York. She is also the vice chair of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Her 1987 book, Whose Votes Count? Affirmative Action and Minority Voting Rights, won many awards, and her book, America in Black and White, written with her husband Stephen Thernstrom, was named one of the most notable books of 1997 by the New York Times. Abigail and Stephen Thernstrom's latest book is No Excuses, Closing the Racial Gap in Learning. Abigail Thernstrom was one of 3 authors chosen by President Bill Clinton to participate in his first town meeting on race in 1997. Our moderator, Boston College's own Alan Wolf, is a professor of political science here and the director of the Boissy Center for Religion and American Public Life. Like our 2 panelists, he is a prolific public intellectual who does not confine his ideas to specialty journals. His many books include One Nation After All, Moral Freedom, and most recently, Return to Greatness, How America Lost Its Sense of Purpose and What It Needs to Do to Recover It. A reminder, the panel will conclude at 3:30. On a housekeeping note, once again, please turn your cell phones off if you have not done so already. There will be an opportunity for questions from the audience. And Alan, take it away. Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone to Boston College, my employer and a place with which I've been identified for some time and for which I have the strongest feelings. It's really an honor to be here and to participate in this event, but really I'm going to shut up. You didn't come here to hear me, you came here to hear our distinguished panelists. So all I'm going to do is say that basically this session is in between the first one and the last one. And the first one was primarily about the history that led up to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. The last one is about the future implications raised by the Voting Rights Act. We're sort of in between. We can actually cover both. We can look back, we can focus on the present, or I'm sure the final panelist won't mind, we can look to the future as well. We're going to proceed this way. Patricia Williams will give a brief introduction. Abigail Thernstrom will follow, and then we'll sit down there after that's done and moderate a discussion, and we'll leave about 15 or 20 minutes for questions from you afterwards. So, Professor Williams, would you like to begin?
It's a tremendous pleasure to be here today. I am sorry we lost our third member, Wade Henderson, who was supposed to be on this panel. I must introduce my remarks by saying that I am not a voting rights expert. I engage in vivacious political commentary, but I am sorry that Mr. Henderson, who for me was an important part of the balance of this panel, is not here. About the climate in which the Voting Rights Act's temporary provisions are being discussed. Certainly the Voting Rights Act had enormous transformative power in our society in terms of the representation of elected officials, and yet we are at a precarious moment, a moment I think that is at least as precarious as the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. I am I still consider myself a Bostonian because I'm still a Red Sox fan. But my mother's family came here shortly after the Civil War, or only a few years after Reconstruction in the South, both because they felt it was better for women. All 6 of my grandmother's sisters came here. They left the brothers, but the sisters came here because they felt it was safer. They came to Boston because it was the home of abolitionists. I am proud to be writing for The Nation because it is still called an abolitionist rag. But they came to participate, to join forces with those both who brought voting rights to women, as well as, much later, to African Americans. My father came shortly after after World War II. He came actually as part of the Army, from Savannah, Georgia, where, as he told me not long ago, they would sit at the breakfast table and read the black press. About once a week, there was a lynching in that part of Georgia, reported for somebody attempting to organize some aspect of political participation. I was raised, as so many African Americans, with a deep sense of what political participation could bring and the cost of that participation. As we exist now in this extraordinary moment, which on the one hand, we are called to notions of colorblindness in which race supposedly does not matter, but at the same time, we are having ciphered conversations in which the great outrage seems to be that we mention race at all, rather than the extraordinary data of disparity, the extraordinary difficulty of reconciling those divisions that do still exist. I do not deny that we have made progress, but I do worry that we're at a precarious moment where we could go back in time. Let me therefore focus on some of my concern about what I am disconcerted about. First of all, we live in a time of red state, blue states, which is as divided as we have been in many, many years. And that red state, blue state division is not simply about Democrat and Republican. It is not simply about conservative and liberal. It is also profoundly about values having to do with the role of men and women, but also values having to do with race and immigration. And that, perhaps most hotly at the center of it, is what we seem to have most difficulty discussing. In the context of 2 elections now, in which race has played an extraordinary visual part, and yet we still seem not to have had enough of a conversation to bring the first, under President Clinton's civil rights, the result of that great examination chaired by Angela Oh and John Hope Franklin. We still can't find that report. I do wonder what happened to it. It, like so many attempted conversations, seemed to have been buried. Again, I am somebody who's written a book called Seeing a Colorblind Future, but let me tell you the subtitle of that is also The Paradox of Race, because we need to see before we can be blind about color. So here we are at a time when, ostensibly, there is no property requirement for race, but we still have questions. Isn't there a property requirement? I have daily conversations with students who graduated with top grades, who are just as unfamiliar with what our Supreme Court, what our Constitution says about voting rights. Our legal literature, this moment in time, is littered with law review articles about perhaps we should be relating voting patterns to wealth, that after all, people who have property are more invested in society, that maybe their vote should count more. It should be like a property owners association. Robert Ellickson at Yale has certainly been somebody who's espoused this point of view. Just this week, I was arguing with students who feel that people on welfare are spending our money, that once they, and not just that this affects public policy and how it is distributed to them, but once it's in their hands, we should be able to tell them not to buy stereos or not to buy junk food, that the parental sense of power is that strong. And this is a kind of paternalism that is very race-based if you scratch the surface of it, although, again, I don't deny the extent to which all poor people in this country suffer from that paternalism. The degree to which we are speaking in ciphers about everything, or if not ciphers, that certain impacts are sort of hard to, I think, understand in terms of how divided we still are, just imagistically. I have a conversation frequently with my students about the image of President Bush when he first, during his first run for president, he began his campaign at Bob Jones University, which, if you recall, was controversial because it was described as an anti-Catholic school. That's not all. It's because it has barred interracial dating, and it really has its roots in a kind of evangelical Christian identity racism that says that God created two separate tribes, blacks and whites. I mean, it's if you look up on Wikipedia, Polygenesis, that is alive and well at Bob Jones University. So we do live in a country that still has profoundly different, even religiously rooted senses of race, and that is still very much a geographic phenomenon. It is still very much part of the red state, blue state divide. We still have, in many of the southern states, completely separate proms. I know about this, and I'm not talking about volunteer proms or whether or not Balsa or whatever else, or the black students are separating themselves voluntarily. I'm talking about separate proms in public schools that have to be sued over. That's how I know about them. In this day and age, I mean, in the 1990s and 1980s, Godby v. Montgomery, Alabama School District is a 1998 case that all of you should probably look up if you don't believe me. So we do live in a community that is extraordinarily divided, a world that is still divided, though we wish it were not so. Does this affect voting? It certainly is part of the backdrop that affects voting. We saw that in the last election. We saw not just felony disenfranchised, but the disenfranchisement of anyone whose name resembled that of a felon. The degree to which this fell disparately upon communities of color, upon liberal communities, upon Jewish neighborhoods in Florida, upon neighborhoods of immigrants, of people who did not speak English, is confirmed by data. But again, we'd rather not talk about it. How does this relate to Section 5 of the Voting Act's right? We have two provisions, well, we have the entire Voting Rights Act, but two provisions that have become particularly controversial. The preclearance of any state's adjustment to access to voting, and the bilingual provision. The bilingual provision is less controversial. It is so related to the literacy requirement that I think it's pretty transparently important that people, whatever language they speak, if they are citizens and meet all of the involvement and are attempting to be politically involved, ought to be able to understand. It's part of the free flow and access of information to which we all should have access. There is no constitutional requirement that we speak English, at least yet. The second is the preclearance, that is to say federal oversight of provisions. Just recently, Georgia, which required a picture ID, a photo ID, federal oversight struck down that particular provision. It sounds neutral, but again, part of the oversight is deciphering the degree to which it may be a cipher for something else. In Georgia, this requirement reduced the possible avenues of identification for purposes of voting from 16 to 6. There are no DMV offices in the city of Atlanta, as preposterous as that sounds. They're all in the suburbs. There are only 56 DMV offices in the entire state of Georgia. And again, in a state that's quite rural, for people who do not have cars, as we saw in Louisiana, getting to a DMV, whether for a driver's license or just for an identification, for identification purposes, involves expenditure that many people do not have, and perhaps that's not visible to those of us who always, who can find it in every shopping mall, as here in a city like Boston. So it's a significant weight, and it requires some oversight to figure that out. And so therefore I am a proponent not simply of dropping this temporary provision, but also expanding it. We live in a time where the technology of voting, particularly with computerized voting, has not been scrutinized sufficiently. I wonder that we have not tied this provision into the necessity, perhaps, of new categories, not simply race, but also new categories of technology, the opportunities for fraud and depriving people based on more malleable and rolling categories of disenfranchisement. It seems to me we need to catch up with that in a world that is as diasporic as we have, in a country as mobile as ours. Let me just end by saying that all of us, our hearts are with those in Iraq who risked their lives to vote. At the same time, that was an election with no international observers. It was an election in which, in certain districts, 98% of the people supposedly turned out. According to every kind of data and sociological analysis, this is so highly unlikely as to raise a very high possibility of fraud. Indeed, under Saddam Hussein, in his last days, if you recall, he had an election in which 99 to 100% of the population turned out. And we here in this country automatically denounced that as impossible and most likely fraudulent. We set a low standard for them in simply having a feel-good response to that election unless we examine these results more carefully. And we set a low standard for ourselves if the correlative phenomenon in this country is the suppression of turnout through cynicism, through knowing what we cannot talk about. Thank you.
Well, it's obviously not easy to follow Patricia Williams, and I'm so glad that she is here on this panel with me. I wanted just to open with a word in response to a question that was raised in the last panel, because I think it's worth straightening out. Somebody asked about the literacy test ban in the original 1965 Act. That ban only applied to those states that also had very low voter turnout, that is, turnout below 50%, black and white together. And that low voter turnout was circumstantial evidence that the literacy test was being used fraudulently. And it was not until 1970 that you had an extension, temporary extension of the ban on literacy tests nationwide, and then 1975, as it was said, was made permanent. But it is important to understand the structure of the original act if you're going to kind of think about its history, its logic, its and so forth. You know, the importance of the act is not in dispute by anyone. I mean, it was, we all celebrate it. It was, and the literacy, that nice statistical trigger coupling the use of a literacy test and low voter turnout was part of, and not having to name any states, not having to go to court to prove disfranchisement, it's part of what made it such perfect legislation. And I can't think of any other congressional act that I would call perfect. It was, at the time, meticulously designed for a very simple, narrow, clearly legitimate end, which was opening polling booths to blacks in states with a record of egregious 15th Amendment violations. And there were no unnecessary parts in the act, and none, none that were extraneous. It is, in my view today, no longer perfect legislation. Indeed, it's a mess. And while its permanent provisions are rightly permanent, its temporary emergency provisions are wildly out of sync with racial reality. in my view. The most important of the emergency provisions, as Patricia Williams said, is Section 5, which requires federal preclearance, federal approval of all districting lines, other electoral changes. If a jurisdiction moves a polling booth across the street, that has to be precleared in what are called the covered jurisdictions. And while the states originally brought under coverage, that is in 1965, were all in the Deep South, today they include scattered counties across the nation, like 3 boroughs in New York City, not the other 2. They also include states of Arizona and Texas, but not New Mexico and Oklahoma. These are places that never had a history of 15th Amendment violations. 3 boroughs in New York, but not the other 2. Give me a break. In this and other ways, in my view, the clean logic, the beautiful design of the original act have been undermined, and Section 5, as a consequence, is no longer indisputably constitutionally sound. It's now arguably unconstitutional, and I don't think it's needed anymore. People have talked at this conference a lot about the absence of conversations. Well, there is a conversation going on right now about whether Section 5 is needed. There are hearings in the House of Representatives on this very subject. I'm glad that Patricia Williams pointed to Georgia's very ugly past. I'm a little confused about her fingering the voter ID question, in that Georgia's voter ID law was just pre-cleared, that is approved by the Justice Department, the Federal Justice Department. But in any case, I'm delighted she pointed to Georgia, because I want to talk about Georgia. I'll give you some facts. They come from the work of 2 political scientists who were commissioned to write a report, to write several reports actually, by me and my co-author on a forthcoming book on voting rights. And these 2 political scientists are looking at race and politics in covered and, I hope, uncovered jurisdictions as well. And their main points with respect to Georgia are the following, and they're worth going through. In the most recent presidential elections, black participation rates actually exceeded those of whites. And if one compares Georgia to states outside the South, black registration is slightly higher, and turnout is roughly the same. At ever increasing rates, blacks are being elected to public office in the state. For instance, 34 office holders in Georgia are elected statewide. Currently, 9 are black. It's a figure just short of proportional racial representation. 1 more elected, and you would have disproportionately high racial representation. 2001, the black leadership in Georgia had become convinced that the election of blacks to office no longer depended on the creation of overwhelmingly majority black districts. The Legislative Black Caucus, in signing on to a 2001 districting plan, was assuming substantial white crossover voting in that state, and it was an assumption built on experience. And last point I'll take from their report, white support for black candidates in Georgia is higher. White support for black candidates in Georgia is higher than black support for white office seekers. In 2004, white Democrats running statewide did no better than those who were black. In fact, looking at the 4 most recent elections, black candidates running statewide had a success rate of 71%, while the white rate was only 41%. America has changed over 4 decades. I don't know what Alex Kazar was talking about in saying he didn't know whether the Voting Rights Act would pass today. Of course, the nation would be very different if the Voting Rights Act hadn't passed, but whatever. America has changed. The South has changed. Let's listen to the voice of John Lewis testifying in a 2002 voting rights case. He said, quote, "We have changed. We've come a great distance. I think it's not just in Georgia, but in the American South. I think people are preparing to lay down the burden of race There has been a transformation. It's an altogether different world. Again, the words of John Lewis in 2002. In recent decades, Section 5 not only came to cover jurisdictions with no history of 15th Amendment violations, it became as well, and there have been a couple of allusions to this, an instrument to insist on race-based districting, racially gerrymandered, bug-splat districts, resting on the assumption that the act created an entitlement to proportionate racial and ethnic representation, which is, of course, a concept no less constitutionally controversial with respect to legislative bodies than with reference to schools and places of employment. We have arrived, and by the way, the Republicans love that racial gerrymandering. So we got both parties on board. We have arrived at a point no one could have envisioned in 1965. Justice O'Connor wrote for a majority in a 1993 Supreme Court decision. I'm going to quote a little bit at length here because it's the heart of the problem as I see it. She wrote a reapportionment plan that includes in one district individuals who belong to the same race and who are otherwise widely separated by geographical and political boundaries and who may have little in common with one another but the color of their skin, bears an uncomfortable resemblance to political apartheid. It reinforces the perception that members of the same racial group, regardless of their age, education, economic status, or the community in which they live, think alike, share the same political interests, and will prefer the same candidates at the polls. The message that such districting sends to elected representatives is equally pernicious. When a district obviously is created solely to effectuate the perceived common interests of one racial group, elected officials are more likely to believe that their primary obligation is to represent only the members of that group rather than their constituency as a whole. This is altogether antithetical to our system of representative democracy. Justice O'Connor, again, for a majority of the Supreme Court in 1993. What is the argument for the reauthorization of Section 5? That provision has been distorted beyond recognition. It's become a holdover from a very different era. In an America in which blacks are increasingly part of mainstream society, and I believe they are, integrated into our national economic and political life, it segregates voters, creating a system, as O'Connor said, of political apartheid. Even scholars on the left recognize, as one put it, that Bull Connor is dead. And recent Supreme Court decisions in areas other than voting suggest its constitutionality will not withstand scrutiny. Section 5 was an emergency provision. Is there a permanent emergency that justifies another 25 years and perhaps 25 years after that? And by the way, I don't know where the figure 25 comes from, but whatever. Anyway, is there a permanent emergency? I don't think so. I would end Section 5 tomorrow. It's not what's going to happen unless the Supreme Court knocks it down. Thanks.
Well, I think probably the place to begin with is with Georgia and what's happening in Georgia, because both of the speakers brought that up, and it is indeed, I think, great importance what's happening in the state of Georgia. Now, I may have this wrong, Professor Williams, tell me if I do, but it seemed to me the essence of what you were saying is that requiring identification for voting, which is, for many people, a difficult thing to do, strikes back to an era when states made it extremely difficult for many people to vote, including members of racial minorities to vote. And that in this sense, what the Georgia legislature is doing bears uncomfortable resemblance to practices that were, in essence, outlawed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and its subsequent amendments. And so that this would be a real step backwards. Abigail Thernstrom, you were having a different interpretation, it seemed to me, of what's going on in Georgia, but I didn't hear you address that directly.
Oh,
so did I interpret you right, essentially?
Yes.
Yes. All right, so Abby, would you?
And I don't think I can talk till I put this on. Hold on a minute. I'm sorry, everybody. I forgot I had to put this on. The voter ID, look, there is legitimate concern. Patricia Williams raised the concern about voter fraud. There is legitimate concern in Ohio, in Massachusetts, in Georgia, in every state in the nation about voter fraud. People have no trouble getting driver's licenses. They can't get on airplanes without IDs. They can't do all sorts of things without going into government buildings. I mean, identifications, IDs are going to become increasingly in the security conscious nation, and the consciousness of security threats is certainly not going to lessen in the foreseeable future. IDs are going to be part of our everyday life. What is wrong with jurisdictions saying, I would like to know that indeed you're registered to vote, that you indeed are a resident? I called up, right after the 2004 presidential election, I called up my local town registration office, and I said, so what does it take to register in this town? And she said, well, just come in and sign something. I said, well, do you have to prove you're a resident? No. Do you have to prove that you are you? No. And I said, well, I've got a son still registered in this town, but he hasn't been living here for years. Could he vote here and and in the state he lives? Well, I guess so, if he wants to bother. Now, okay, so we're asking for IDs. I have to show my ID in life all the time. Maybe it's because I go in and out of government buildings all the time, but what's the big deal?
I think the big deal has to do with what type of identification for which you're asked, and the access to being able to get that. First of all, there's two entirely separate public policy concerns about the issuance of, or the requirement of IDs for boarding a plane, and the requirement of ID for voting. The security and personal safety supposedly assured by an ID. I'm not sure there's any connection anyway with that in terms of getting, maybe we should get everybody to have a bomb-sniffing dog before they get on a plane. I'm not sure that showing a driver's license is necessarily going to do that. But with regard to identification, I'm not arguing, and the state of, the lawsuit involving the state of Georgia didn't argue that you shouldn't have some identification as a resident. It specifically is concerned about photo identification, which for people in rural areas in particular, or poor people, is almost exclusively a driver's license. You and I have plenty of photo IDs, and I'll tell you, I have 3 forms of photo ID. I have my driver's license, because I am privileged from the state to get a driver. It is a privilege. It's not unlike voting, which is, we would like to think of as a right. I have a photo ID to get into Columbia University, because it is a very elite institution, and they have the machinery and the mechanics to have a swipe card to keep the riffraff out. Presumably, you don't have that same standard for the voting booth. Thirdly, I have a passport, because I am privileged enough to have the money and the time and the opportunity to travel beyond our borders, and that also requires some time and effort and some money. Now, if I've been to Atlanta a few times, and I've stayed at the Renaissance Hotel downtown the last time for a conference. I brought my son, and we wanted to go to the Martin Luther King home. I decided we're going to get some exercise. We're going to walk just within the city of Atlanta. It was almost impossible. We ended up having to take a taxi because it was impossible to get from the Renaissance to Martin Luther King's house on a hot day. You had to cross a freeway. There was no way to get there. Now I read that apparently they have removed the 2 DMV offices from the city limits, this downtown proper, which is largely a black area, or the city proper, as opposed to Buckhead, is it, or the suburbs. How does one get there if one does not have the money for a car? If one is living on a check that barely provides subsistence? Taxis, and what about, so you have to sort of invoke the whole nature of public transportation, which is very similar to what's happened here in Boston when they took the Orange Line out of the neighborhood I grew up in, rerouted it into a more gentrified neighborhood. So now the closest would no longer be Eggleston Station, which is where I grew up. It is now like Stony Brook, which is a mile in the other direction. So I think that the ability to have access to a particular kind of ID is what's at issue. Not that, of course, anybody can go in and vote simply by giving, your say-so.
Oh, wait a minute. The government can offer alternative IDs for those residents of the state who do not have driver's licenses, which, by the way, neither of us have the exact numbers, but I would suspect that the percentage of Georgia residents without a driver's license is in fact very low, but in any case, there can be an alternative ID. It seems to me one should worry about low voter turnout among the less educated and the less affluent in this society, and not about whether you have to show a voter ID. That's not what is keeping people from voting.
My concern is that there is some relation, because even those IDs, which are not driver's license, are issued by the DMV. None of that alters the issue of access to DMV
in states
offices.
across the nation that do not ask for voter IDs, you have low voter turnout among certain sectors of the population. It is not changed by having, I suspect, by having a voter ID or not a voter ID. I think again, the focus should be on organizing people to get to the polls who normally don't vote.
Just the fact that there's an argument about this and a controversy suggests that the whole country, if we're representative of the discussion in the country, hasn't reached consensus yet on the fact that we've solved some of these issues around voting. The reason why I brought up the Georgia case is because it seems to serve as a reminder that we also need to talk about what voting itself is and what voting represents. And I think lying behind this controversy is a sense that voting means two very, very different kinds of things. On the one hand, when you vote, you are expressing a duty or an obligation as a citizen of a country. And you are reaffirming your membership in the country. In that sense, the act of voting is not partisan. It represents a commitment to the country as a whole, and it's an act of citizenship. But on the other hand, the United States, and not all other countries do this, the United States allows the way in which the vote is actually carried out, and the eligibility requirements do get tied up with partisan issues. It gets tied up in legislatures, and parties have specific political interests one way or the other, and how many people vote, and so on. Our country is really strikingly different in that sense, because once it gets into the partisan arena, then that kind of breeds distrust. Parties, after all, exist to distrust each other. They exist in competition with each other. We had a panel this morning, just before this one, that reminded us of the history here. And one of the questions that arose is, how much is different now than when the Voting Rights Act was passed? And with respect to what I'm just saying, I would point out two major differences. One is that the political atmosphere in which both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act passed were much more bipartisan. In fact, both pieces of legislation had strong bipartisan support, whereas now we seem to live in a much more intensely partisan environment. And the other thing is, President Johnson was famously quoted as saying that when he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, he was essentially consigning his party to political death, but that there was something more than his party that was at stake for him. And that also, on both sides of the spectrum, no longer seems to be. People put party first to a really remarkable degree. So in this kind of heavily, Patricia Williams, you began with a polarization in the country. The mere fact of that polarization seems to suggest that we're not going to get a consensus around voting and settle the issue.
But we may not have consensus, but the idea that, I don't know, stating it that way almost predicts continuing paralysis. I would really like to tease out the fact that I do think there is a relationship between the form of ID that's required and voter turnout. This is not the only relationship. There are also other reasons for low voter turnout in minority communities. But they are related to precisely the same poverty that makes it difficult for somebody to go to a DMV office. In New York City, the city in which I believe we both live, I don't know whether you live in Concord. That's right.
No,
but
neither one. I don't live in Concord either.
I associate with the Manhattan Institute, I guess.
Yeah, I am at the Manhattan Institute, but I don't live in New York.
But in New York, 50% of all African American men from 18 to 65, that's the entire working age population, are unemployed. If this doesn't contribute to low voter turnout, whether or not one has a specific requirement in the law regarding specific access to the voting booth, I don't know what does. And I think that unemployment is one reason. Certainly felony disenfranchisement has been another reason that has been more on the front page. But I think that it is also important to link the activity of specific voter fraud, regardless of what the law says, regardless of the Voting Rights Act. And this is an ongoing problem as well. So you have in various apartment buildings in the urban north, all the elevators go out in the entire black neighborhood, or virtually all of the ones in the public housing. This is voter fraud. It's not necessarily quite the same thing as a poll tax in the South, but it does seem to me we have to link those two. And again, for me, this is evidence that we need to be talking about expanding this sort of preclearance review rather than contracting it.
Alan, I'm very bothered by the implication that all low-income Americans are black and all blacks are low-income. We have half of blacks in the middle class, a third living in suburbia. And when you're talking about voter turnout and who doesn't show up at the polls, you're talking about the less educated, the less affluent across racial and ethnic groups. So, Americans don't talk about class. They keep talking about race and ethnicity, but, the picture here is one of class.
It is also one of race, however, and that's what I thought we were talking about. I'm very happy to expand some of this to the question of class. But we also have a very weirdly racialized way of talking about class in this country, where the underclass is everybody who's sort of unemployed in the black community, and the middle class is anybody who's employed and above. And
This is
actually,
self-identification.
No, but when you actually look at the social data and how people analyze this, including yourself, if I'm not mistaken, anybody who is, and again, the question of wealth as opposed to, overall wealth, including, there have been many, The Color of Money is a wonderful website that talks about African Americans who are supposedly middle class but don't have houses, for example, who are continual renters or who are one paycheck away. And so I think there's a substantial difference between those whom we call the white middle class and the black middle class. But we actually don't talk about a white middle class. The middle class is assumed to be white. And then we talk about the black middle class in this sort of extra nominative way as a kind of category that's separate. The middle class is not somebody who's integrated. It's soccer moms. It's white suburbia. And then the black middle class is anybody, and I've heard, Bill Cosby, Oprah Winfrey is somehow an example of the new black middle class.
They're not middle class.
Of course they're not middle class. Of course they're not middle class. But every messenger, every secretary is called the new black middle class. And it's true, we are working in more integrated environments. There are more of us employed in so-called middle-class environment. But in fact, the people in unions, the secretaries, the messengers are part of the black working class. We don't have a vocabulary for the black working class. We have somehow collapsed this vocabulary into underclass and then the new black middle class. And I think that erases a great deal of that part of what's attributable to, I think that particular category, black middle class, collapses class and race in a way that is, we talk about class differently than we do in England or in France. Class here is much more racialized.
If we could go back to the Voting Rights Act itself for a minute. Abby Thurstrom, you were pretty clear about your feelings about Section 5. Is there anything else in the act that you also think is no longer necessary?
Well, 203, Section 203, which provides for bilingual ballot materials and bilingual ballots, is fine with me. It should be extended. I can't think of a single argument against that. You can make the logical argument that, or you can ask a logical question when it is a requirement for citizenship in this country that you can read English. Why is this necessary? Well, I don't even want to go there. It is fine with me to extend those provisions. The real issue is Section 5, the preclearance provision.
So if that were out, you would endorse, testify strongly for renewal?
Of 203?
Yeah.
Of 203, of the language provision.
No, I'm sorry, the whole thing.
Oh, if Section 5 were out, but Section 5 is the issue.
Right.
I mean, that is the issue that hearings are being held on. Now, of course, you can dump into the conversation in Congress other issues that have been raised today, but so far are not part of the congressional debate, namely felon enfranchisement, voter ID, and so forth. I mean, you could dump into that. There is, as part of the congressional debate, there are, and maybe Roger Clegg in the next section, sitting over there, will, in the next session, I should say, will touch on this. There, as part of the mix in the conversation, there are questions about overturning some recent Supreme Court decisions by clarifying language in the Voting Rights Act that would, as I say, overturn those decisions. But a lot of the issues are not on the table, and I think a lot of the issues like felon enfranchisement and so forth that are not on the table, that's because the Republicans and Democrats have basically come to a deal to extend Section 5 for 25 years. They don't really want to hear any dissenting voices, and the reason they're both happy with that deal is because Republicans adore race-based districting, because in the South, when you drain black voters from adjacent districts adjacent to these overwhelmingly black constituencies, those districts that have become overwhelmingly white, that are no longer biracial or multiracial, are fertile ground for Republican candidates. And so the Republicans adore all this racial gerrymandering. They are laughing all the way to the political bank, and they made a deal in Congress.
But
Well, let me ask, can I ask you about that? I mean,
Yeah, can I say something about that? Because I actually think that here, in fact, is where you have a commonality of class concern. Because, in fact, you're talking about the Republican elite. And, in fact, this new gerrymandering by white Republicans in the South has actually placed a
Not so
tremendous
new.
burden on white rural residents who are very upset because they have been clumped in ways that are contrary to their interests and mean less representation, not just for poor blacks, but also for poor whites.
Well,
it
but
seems
wait
to
a
me,
minute.
if
Well,
I could.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was a little frustrated by the discussion of the same issue in the previous session, so I want to try to sharpen it a little bit. I mean, the point has been made that the consequences of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were to produce a much greater number of African Americans in Congress that would have been in Congress had there not been the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And in that sense was a victory for racial justice in America. But that the cost of that was to contribute so many more white Republicans to Congress that Congress itself, while more racially representative of the country as a whole, in policy terms was much more hostile to the interests of African Americans because it was much more Republican. And that's the question that I really want to get at. You know, Patricia, do you buy that line of argument? Because it does seem to suggest that if that's the case, then people who are interested in racial progress in this country should have serious questions about whether creating more districts that are primarily African American is the way to do it.
No, I think there's been an abuse of gerrymandering in certain districts, and those have been the controversial ones. We have seen that, and that has been an ongoing discussion. I think that, you can, abuse any process that we come up with to make some of the results that we've seen in certain districts. But I also think that the turn to the right has been a far, the causes of that are far broader than simply what's happened with one particular voting mechanism. That has to do with everything from Buckley v. Vallejo, the Supreme Court case, which allows money, the expenditure of money to be a First Amendment right of expression, that it is the same as expression. That case in the late 1980s has transformed our political finance. I think that the degree to which the concentration of media has allowed for sound bites to run our political discourse has been horribly detrimental to meaningful political discussion, and those who speak best in sound bites have had the run of the place. And that means we are being run by those who love to oversimplify. So I think that the causes of the current, of our current political moment are complex, and the bottom line in terms of what has transformed in the last 8 years, or the last 2 elections, I should say, have to do with Bush v. Gore and a variety of still contested outcomes that go far beyond, again, what the Voting Rights Act
Well, you called these
predicted
abuses.
should have said. I
abuses,
mean, maybe we need a
yeah.
whole new Voting Rights
Uh-huh.
Act around the question of computer voting, around the question of what happened in Ohio. Again, I'd like to link the discussion to the kind of political debate we had, that somebody earlier had said this was a moment in which we had public policy coming together and public power, but now we also have a third public, which is public relations, determining the debate, and I think that perhaps we need to bring that into a new review.
All sorts of things. First place, it is state legislatures that do the districting. And the process has become, first, the majority-minority districts are drawn. I mean, such is the power. Oh, and this is a wonderful change in America. I applaud it. Such is the power now of the black vote and black members of state legislatures. But also, they don't want to tangle with the Justice Department, which judges districting plans by the standard of what the ACLU called max black plans, the maximum number of max black plans. Max Hispanic plans. Anyway, state legislatures draw these districting plans. They first draw the majority black districts, or majority black and Hispanic, or majority Hispanic districts, and then other pieces fall into place around them. The other pieces, of course, involve incumbency protection and whatever, but those districts are made safe. It is the first act. I mean, in terms of the impact of the Voting Rights Act on blacks in office, look, black enfranchisement in and of itself meant that you had an enormous new powerful black vote. How many blacks would be in elected office without the racial gerrymandering? I don't know, and neither does anybody else. What I do know is that it's not simply a question of abuses by now. This standard of proportional racial and ethnic representation is built into the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act and has been sanctioned by the courts, but it doesn't really matter what the courts have to say on this because the Justice Department is off on a tear of its own. Look, in Georgia versus Ashcroft, 2003 Supreme Court decision, the Legislative Black Caucus in the state of Georgia testified, not so many majority black districts is not what we want. We can win elections with what are called influence districts. That is, districts in which blacks are a substantial minority, but not a majority. We will be better off with a combination of influence districts, some majority black districts. We will have, as a consequence, more white Democrats elected to office. And in terms of our representation, that will increase. Ashcroft is one of the decisions that may be overturned by Congress this or next year.
Well, I think it's time to begin to invite people to come to the microphone to ask questions, but I also, as in the previous panel, want to exercise my prerogative and sort of ask one last one. Here's what I'm really trying to get at. We heard about how 90-some% of seats in Congress are safe seats now, about the decline of electoral competition in general. Some of the feelings that have been aroused by the fact that we have majority-minority districts are not dissimilar from some of the feelings that we have primarily white ex-urban districts or primarily poor white or black districts. There's been a study done of congressional elections by 2 political scientists which show that the homogeneity of congressional districts around the country has been increasing. It used to be that the way congressional districts were divided, you got all kinds of different people within one district. So the congressman or congresswoman representing that district was representing all kinds of different people. Now, homogeneity so that you have wealthy districts, you have poor districts, and so there's been a kind of segregation, not in racial terms, but just a general segregation across all congressional districts. And I think that, you know, the critique that's been made of the Voting Rights Act is that to the degree that it creates a class of office holders dependent upon a homogeneous district in order to be reelected, it removes as an incentive taking on the whole system and changing this whole system, which I believe is dangerous for democracy. And so a kind of minority voice that in the past would have been arguing in favor of justice or of democracy is removed for the sake of protecting the seats of those who already have pretty safe seats. And I don't know if either of you want to respond to that.
I mean, I do think you're mistaking the particular manipulations that have occurred in particular places with the oversight provision of Section 5.
It may be.
Which allows precisely for guarding against concentrations that result in untoward segregation. The segregation to which you refer in certain places, particularly in the South, has been precisely the result of white Republican influence, not because of African American pushing. The other dimension of the segregation to which you're referring is housing segregation. Ms. Thernstrom and I come from very different perspectives. She assumes that the country is sufficiently integrated.
I didn't say sufficiently.
I didn't say integrated. Integrated. That the product of the civil rights movement has been an integration over which the civil rights movement or the Civil Rights Act should have little more to say because we have reached the promised land.
No, I didn't say that either. I didn't say we had reached the promised land. Don't distort what I have to say. I
Please keep your question short and brief.
I would never say we've reached the promised land.
But
I would say there's been much progress.
my concern is that 92% of African Americans in this country voted not just Democratic, but also for the civil rights heritage and legacy that Ms. Thernstrom keeps referring to as a holdover or as the greedy establishment. And I think that that's a profound division of perception based on the experience, which again goes to the data of how actually segregated we are. Again, I think we share a common dream, but our perception of where we are at this moment is pretty far apart.
Well, look.
Let's turn the question.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something to you on the nonpartisan districting, but whatever.
All right, let's go ahead quickly. We'll take 2 and then 1 from each mic.
Thank you. My name is David Harris. I'm a proud member of the Board of Directors of the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities. I also direct an organization called the Fair Housing Center of Greater Boston. I'd like to make 2 comments. One, I'd like to point out to Professor Thernstrom that in Massachusetts and across the country, discrimination in housing remains a vital part of our life, and that discrimination is not limited to low-income people. That discrimination against people, African Americans and people of color across the income spectrum is documented in our own studies. Huge racial disparities in mortgage denials. In fact, with greater disparities among high-income blacks than greater disparities among high-income blacks than low-income whites. So I think that the questions of whether or not the problems are class-based and not race-based are matters for continued debate and discussion, and I think in need of legislative relief. I'd also say that there's something I find disturbing about citing the most egregious examples of racial gerrymandering. It reminds me somewhat of the welfare moms driving Cadillacs argument, and it obscures the very real problems that we have. So I think we can find horror stories to support any position, but I think we need to look at the overall picture. And
Thank you. Can we move?
my question, and I am actually going to ask a question, and my question is, in an era in which there's legislation moving through the Congress today that will, this is directed to you, so perhaps this part you'd listen to, where we have legislation that's passing through Congress right now that will limit the ability of nonprofit organizations that do voter education and voter registration to receive federal dollars, how that meshes with a movement to eliminate the protections we have from the Voting Rights Act.
One more. I'd like to move. Could try to be a little more brief, please.
Could I get an answer to the question?
You will.
Okay.
I'm taking two at a time, and then we're getting answers. My goodness.
All right.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to raise a way of thinking about the issue.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Tim Kensla, and I'm a social studies teacher at the public high school in Norwell, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston. I was actually going to ask a question about the intractable problem of residential segregation. I could easily say in one of the many lily white suburbs of Boston. I mean, that's sort of the 900-pound gorilla in the house, the continuing intractable problem of racial segregation, residential segregation. But as I was hearing the thoughts about voter IDs, I was remembering the first time I went to register to vote. And now I'm a person who was going to grow up to be a social studies teacher, and so I started to think about, why haven't they asked me for an ID? And they asked me for an ID when I cash a check. They asked me for an ID when I borrow a library book. And I could easily register under a false name. I could easily register in several jurisdictions at once. But it occurred to me that what they were saying to me was the threat that I might do that was less of a danger than the idea that I might not be able to exercise the franchise. That on some fundamental level, it was important that in this act, I was on my honor. On this act, as I went to register to vote, that I said, I'm here as a citizen ready to take part in the franchise, I was on my honor. So I want to ask you, rather than should it be made more stringent, isn't this level of participation important enough that in many ways all of us as citizens should be on our honor when we say, I'm here, I'm ready to participate in the process? The way I was and was surprised to be 30 years ago when I first went to register to vote in the city of Boston.
Can I ask the panelists to respond to both questions, please?
Okay. Look, you want to tell me how much discrimination there still is in Massachusetts? Fine. Let's have Section 5 cover Massachusetts and every other state in the nation as well. Want to have national coverage? It's okay by me. Partly it's okay by me because it's so unmanageable, the whole thing would collapse. But, you know, I mean, that is the logical end of your argument. I don't want to go on to the whole question of residential segregation. We could spend an hour on that. Well, no, okay, we could spend a week on it, a month on it, a year on it, whatever.
No, should we go?
I have heard that, I see that raised constantly, that if we expand it, the whole system will become unmanageable.
You can expand it as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, I mean, that if we made it a national review process, and I guess I think that we haven't even tried to expand it a little bit, never mind the prospect of expanding it nationally. But it would be very interesting to figure out what that conversation would look like about really aligning the conversation about voter isolation and fraud and racism in, for example, public housing in New York City or on the south side of Chicago, with the review of what has gone on in Philadelphia, Mississippi?
Well, we have expanded it in 70 and 75 to jurisdictions with no history comparable to that of the Deep South, no history of 15th Amendment violations. As far as I'm concerned, as I said, you can expand it nationally. But the coverage as it's defined today is arbitrary. It makes no sense.
See if we can get in 2 more questions, and then we'll go this way.
Okay. Hi, I'm a student here at Boston College. I'm a junior, and I'm only 20 years old, so I'm still learning a lot of things, but I just had a quick question on Section 5. We're looking at this in my Eyes on the Prize class with Professor Peters, and I didn't really know a lot about it, but it seems to me that Section 5 serves as a check on, corrupt systems, and I understand that things, 40 years ago, that things have changed, and that there are, that there are probably different places in which, segregation or these things have been happening. But over the years, that Section 5 has been in place, I think somewhere upwards of 1,000 to many hundreds of cases of these, that this helps the voting rights and things like that. Oh my God, I'm getting really flustered. I'm really sorry. But I think you answered this, but I'm not sure. Instead of just getting rid of Section 5 altogether, is there a way that, instead of writing it off the history books, just reincorporating it to the system? You said there's something about, is there a perpetual emergency? No, I wouldn't say that there's a perpetual emergency, but there is still an emergency. Things are very, very unequal still to this day regarding voting rights. And I just think what's going on in Georgia it's rather suspect when it comes to that.
Thank you. One last question, then we'll... All right, go ahead.
I appreciate the debate that has kind of come about. At least there's getting a little deeper. But I'm really disappointed to hear kind of I'm sorry. My name's Adam Gibbons. I'm a social studies teacher here in Boston, grew up in Maryland, lived in Georgia for a couple of years. Been here in Boston for 10 years. And I'm just disappointed to hear a discussion where there's so much defensiveness about where things are, rather than a recognition that there's going to be many factors involved. And I sort of hear Sternstrom identifying Ms. Williams' point as the point that will drive all sort of issues, rather than acknowledging that it's one issue and there may be others. Rather than discounting it because it's not the issue that will define how voting rights changes or moves or will be changed. And to say that the answer is to focus on how to get people to vote is, I don't know how you do that without looking at a bunch of different factors. To also to kind of put out there I'm glad to hear the marking the benchmarks that we have made, and that's important. However, to look at that as, okay, we've made it because it's proportionally comparable to population, is to ignore the health disparities in our country. So you looked at one set of factors, the voting representation, but totally ignored the health statistics in our country, the incarceration rates, and the history of discrimination, and how that creates such a lack of trust for people who have been discriminated against. And the lack of awareness, I think, on part of majority whites who don't have any experience, pretty much, in encountering race and what discrimination really feels like. And this country has never apologized, really, for slavery officially. So we've got all kinds of problems in our society, and I think it's really a disservice to keep pointing out that we've reached a benchmark in terms of representation, in terms of our population percentages, because maybe somebody just needs to point out that is one statistic and one aspect of our country's growth, but it by no means defines the country growing in all ways and all necessary ways to reach an egalitarian society where there's free movement and growth.
All right, let me ask
And
the,
so I was going to ask a question, but go ahead.
I wanted to ask the panelists to respond. I thought you had asked your question.
I was going to ask a question about Florida and whatnot, but
Let me ask the panel, I think we'll end on this, but I just wanted to say, this was an afternoon symposium on the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was not about the healthcare system. It was not about other things. All those other things are enormously important. You're absolutely right. But it is, I think, a little unfair to criticize the panelists for sticking to the subject of what they were asked to speak about. I said I thought it was a little unfair to ask the panelists to speak about the subject that they were asked to speak about. If you want to blame someone, blame me and the other people who are moderating. Don't blame the panelists. This is about the voting. This is about the Voting Rights Act.
Being told to be quiet and to only follow the path there, to let the audience participate, some anger be.
I would like to respond. I'd like to respond to the audience before we have to go because time is up. Look, one thing that has not been mentioned in either of the panels is that there is a permanent provision in the Voting Rights Act. It's Section 2 of the Act, which protects against all voting arrangements, existing arrangements, long-standing arrangements, changes in voting procedure, whatever, that arguably have a discriminatory result. And all the federal courts of the land are open. Plaintiffs can go in and argue against the Georgia voter ID or any other issue, so that if Section 5 were to disappear, which, as I said, it's not going to, because the fix is in between the Republicans and Democrats in Congress, and the entire Congressional Black Caucus is on board. It's not true this is being driven by white Republicans. If Section 5 were to disappear, you do have a permanent provision in the Act which allows both the Justice Department and allows private plaintiffs to go into local federal courts and bring a complaint about voter discrimination.
Professor Williams, you have the last word.
I guess, I think it's both too cynical and too optimistic to say the fix is in. As redundant as, or as oxymoronic as that sounds. I guess I am, I find the degree to which we are, in some of these debates, almost protecting the voting system against the participation of certain others. I'm not saying here, but I taught civil rights last year, and I teach it from time to time, and I am very concerned that we are having a debate in which African Americans are generally viewed as criminal. William Bennett's most recent comment about if you aborted all black babies and they would, you'd drop the criminal. And this has this kind of conversation, the sense of fear, even in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, of people pouring across from black neighborhoods into the white surrounding suburbs. One also hears around protecting our legislature, our Senate, our House of Representatives from people who are going to vote for criminals. We had a long debate about the felony disenfranchisement policies. And there was a sense that felons would only vote for felons. I guess I've been, which does not encompass the problems of the current administration, but this is not what they meant. But I guess there was a comment about feeling honored when one went into, or going on one's honor into the voting booth. And I guess I sometimes sense that the debate around the African American electorate about the black congressional caucus as only being some sort of cabal disrespects. It isn't just the individual voter we need to honor. It is what those elective, what we are trying to bring
to the national conversation. This is not a separate conversation, the Congressional Black Caucus. It is part of a national conversation, and that's what we should be honoring, as well as the individual who comes to the voting booth. It is the product of those voting patterns, as I try very hard to honor those who are currently in office, even if hopefully some of them are on their way out.
Patricia Williams, that will have to be the last word. Patricia, thank you very much. Abigail Thernstrom, Alan Wolf, for a very frank and sometimes hot conversation, and thanks to the audience too for your questions. There's a third panel. Many of the issues that have been brought up will spill over into that panel.